let's talk about great men. Have you ever seen the cover of Steve Jobs' biography? I've seen the picture on books sold on the sidewalks in Delhi, even in Buddhist temples in Phuket. That famous photo, black and white, his face half in shadow, the turtleneck, the Harry Potter glasses. It gets sold next to books like How to Win Friends and Influence People and 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. People probably see these books on their shitty commutes and think, one day, that'll be me. That Steve Jobs book, which even Steve Jobs never read, was a masterstroke in self-promotion. Jobs didn't care what was written in it. He only cared about the cover, which was smart. It's too long for most readers, 600 plus pages, but on it Jobs looks interesting, enigmatic. And if you ever open it, you see the names of other people the author Walter Isaacson has written about. Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, Leonardo da Vinci. You know, geniuses who changed the world. The History of the World, wrote 19th century thinker Thomas Carlyle, is but the biography of great men. This, in a nutshell, is great man theory, a theory that's basically taken hold of the world. I mean, sure, there's people who think that history is shaped by other things, social movements, technology, evolution, God. But for the most part, we love a good hero. The only thing we really argue about is which hero we should worship the most. Great man theory originates from the Enlightenment, a period between 1680 and 1800 in Europe that in many ways is similar to our own times. Known as the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment was a period when new technology, naval engineering, cartography, printing presses, guns, vaccines, clocks, was revolutionizing European society. The West was sucking up the ideas, wealth, technologies of the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and this meant that Europe was transformed from a feudal backwater isolated by religious conservatives and warring clans into a thriving intellectual and industrial hub in just 200 years. Suddenly, places that had barely heard news from neighboring cities were reading pamphlets on what people from the Americas thought of the Christian religion. It was as shocking as if aliens had descended from outer space. Europe entered a kind of identity crisis, and European thinkers, newly freed of the restrictions of Catholic rule, were forced to cling onto one anchor in all the chaos: rationalism. Faith, not in a church leader or a monarch, but in the so-called human intellect. An intellect is personified not as a deity or a king, but as a great man, a genius. Before this, biographies in Europe weren't really written about real people. Only monarchs, mythical heroes, and saints. Hagiographies, biographies about the lives of saints, were written to venerate religious icons, describing their miraculous deeds, supreme virtue, and absolute obedience to God. But during the Age of Reason, when religious doctrine proved inadequate to explain a rapidly changing world, people needed new role models. People who were not divine, but real, and not obedient, but rebellious. Philosophers like Socrates, a non-Christian who believed in ideals above the laws and religion of his government and sacrificed himself for those ideals. Scientists like Galileo, who stood up against the Catholic Church to argue that the earth revolved around the sun, despite persecution. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, who used scientific observations to add realism to his art. Writers like Shakespeare, who they credited with reinventing and revitalizing language itself. If you Google genius today, many of the names that come up are the chosen elect of the Enlightenment period. It was intellects and scholars who canonized these individuals, scholars like Samuel Johnson, who argued that Shakespeare was the greatest writer who ever lived, writers like Voltaire, who argued that Galileo was a kind of martyr for reason. Just like the saints, these people performed miracles, were divinely inspired, and willing to sacrifice their very life for their ideas. But unlike saints, they were not chosen by the church, but by scholars, academics who argued for their greatness. Inspired by these portrayals, the Enlightenment produced many intellectual bad boys. People like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who questioned the idea of Western civilization and argued for the superiority of the indigenous ways of life. People like Voltaire, who criticized censorship and supported freedom of speech. Writers like Thomas Paine, who rejected monarchy, and scientists like Isaac Newton, who challenged the traditional ideas of physics and the doctrines of the church. Of all the ideas that upended the 1700s, including the idea of gravity itself, one proved more dangerous than any other. Equality. The idea of equality between all human beings was one that could fuel rebellions, dismantle empires, abolish slavery, kill kings. It could dismantle every kind of hierarchy, could end the rule of politicians over populations, of the West over the world. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Latin American Wars of Independence are all events that can be traced to Enlightenment ideas. And the search for liberty and equality could be bloody and cruel. So after the Enlightenment comes the Victorian era, between 1837 and 1901, and the idea of equality falls out of fashion. In fact, there was a lot of money to be made in the exact opposite, empire. The looting of the Americas, of Asia, and Africa became systematized and official, performed by professionalized expert classes. Middle-class morality, marital monogamy, heterosexuality, nuclear families, anti-miscegenation became legally enforced as laws were written to control even the sexual pleasures of the nation. Church leaders now worked hard to create justifications for the enslavement of populations, and scientists created objective theories as to why equality was unscientific, and racial and gender hierarchies were just natural facts. A new social order was born, one that continued the Enlightenment idea of progress, but eschewed the idea of equality, or questioning authority at all. And under these circumstances, great man theory was born. Thomas Carlyle, the so-called father of great man theory, did not believe in equality. Born at the tail end of the Enlightenment, he was anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic, and believed very much that progress is the result of an elite set of exceptional individuals. Politically, he believed in the rule of benevolent dictators, great men of superior virtue, honesty, and intelligence who ruled absolutely. He was a supporter of slavery, not accepting the American chattel slavery of African and indigenous peoples. He was absolutely a supporter of the British Empire and its colonial activity, and of the dominion of men over women, of course. His views have been characterized as romantic elitism. Some even called him a proto-fascist. Head of Nazi propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, spent his last days in the bunker reading Thomas Carlyle's biography of Frederick the Great. Carlyle wrote lectures on great men, most notably Odin, don't ask, Muhammad, Dante, Shakespeare, Martin Luther, John Knox, Samuel Johnson, Rousseau, Robert Burns, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon, and Frederick the Great. He also sought to analyze the characteristics that made someone great, arguing that it was 1, sincerity, the absolute focus on a central mission, 2, vision, i.e. genius, the ability to see deeper into things than the average man, 3, willpower, the ability to impose order on chaos, 4, moral leadership, the discipline to not become a tyrant, and 5, spiritual depth, the connection to a higher power. Now, isn't it interesting that Carlyle chose to admire rather bloody and totalitarian political leaders? Oliver Cromwell rose to power in a bloody civil war. He was an autocrat who controlled the belief systems of the populations under his rule and attempted to genocide the Irish people. Napoleon was an autocrat who rose up during a civil war, one who launched many wars. Frederick the Great was famous for being a military strategist, as well as a ruthless leader who reinforced the Prussian feudal system and was later widely admired by Nazi leadership. Even Martin Luther, the man credited with launching the theological rebellion against the Catholic Church, was politically vicious. When peasants rose up against their feudal lords in Germany, Luther urged the nobility to, quote, smite, slay, and stab. Such wonderful times, when a prince can win heaven by bloodshed. So Carlyle basically transforms the Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality into their opposite, authoritarianism. He doesn't believe everyone deserves the right to freedom of expression and creativity. He thinks some people are special, and they should guide the vast majority, who simply aren't. Ironically, many people Carlyle thought of as great men would have abhorred his politics. The poet Robert Burns was an egalitarian who sympathized with the democratic aims of France's First Revolution. Rousseau was very pro-democracy and anti-authoritarian. Carlyle is respected as a moral authority and scholar for most of his life, but dies a controversial figure in 1881. Not only did his authoritarian views divide followers, his treatment of his wife, recorded in a series of her published letters, showed that he had treated a brilliant woman with cruelty and contempt. Carlyle, it turned out, was authoritarian politically and domestically. He expected his talented wife to waste her days attending to his arbitrary needs and neuroses. Genius is a great thing, she wrote, but it's a great bore to live with. Great man theory masks itself as inspirational and empowering, but in actuality is a justification for obedience to those already in power. Rather than encouraging individualism, creativity, skepticism, great man theory teaches us to identify greatness in larger-than-life personalities, grooming us to follow them, to emulate them, to abuse and be abused. And it's working, isn't it? I mean, that's what fascism is all about.